Hi everybody, I'm Mike McCrory and this is Would You Make It? So I bought this piece of ebony from a friend of mine and he's had it in storage for more than 20 years and he said it was already pretty old when he bought it. So it's got to be at least 30, maybe 40 years old. And I thought this would be perfect for making chess pieces out of. I've already made some chess pieces out of hickory, but the problem with that is I had to stain them black in the end. So ebony will be ideal because it's naturally black. This will be my first time turning ebony, so I'm really looking forward to giving this a try. The first thing I need to do is figure out how to cut this into a manageable size. This piece right here is 74 pounds, so it's much too heavy to work with. I think what I can do is cut it along in this direction using a chainsaw. Hopefully my little chainsaw is powerful enough to cut through ebony, which is fairly hard. If not, I'll try it with my bandsaw. So let's get started. I wasn't sure how good the chainsaw was going to be at cutting this. I had sharpened the blade, but it's a pretty small chainsaw and it was not running very well. It was definitely a challenge to cut such a hard piece of wood. So at this point, I should have known better and used a jig to hold the log in a fixed orientation. But the wood is so expensive that I didn't want to waste any part of the log by putting screws into it to hold it in the jig. So I thought I could do it on my own, but I turned out to be wrong. At this point here, you can see that something happened, and after I examined the blade, I realized that I broke off a tooth, and the blade was just unable to cut after that. So I saved a little bit of money on wood, but I spent $150 to get a replacement blade. So I went back to the chainsaw to cut the rest of the wood, and when I tried to start the chainsaw, I just couldn't get it to start, and I was getting impatient, so I went out and bought a new one because I hadn't been that happy with this older chainsaw anyway. Since I was in the process of dulling all my tools, I figured I may as well take a run at my jointer as well. So what I'm doing here is I'm running the wood through the jointer several times to get a relatively flat edge that I can run along the fence of my bandsaw with a new blade. This time around it was much easier to cut, but I also chose not to use my expensive blade because I didn't want to damage another one. So I'm just using a fairly inexpensive half-inch blade for this. And you can see the sparks coming out of the wood, so it's either extremely hard or it's got some metal fragments in it. Now I'm cutting off each end of the piece so that I can mount it into my lathe. It's always good to have sharp gouges to work with, but it's particularly important with something like ebony that's so hard. To help with the sharpening, I'm using the one-way Wolverine grinding jig that helps to hold the gouge in place so that I can rotate it with a consistent angle. The first piece that I'm going to make is a queen. And in this video, I'm not going to show how I made all the pieces because I've already made a video like that. And in that video, I used hickory for all the pieces. In this case, I'm using ebony and boxwood. And the nice thing about this is I will not have to stain the ebony, whereas with the ash pieces, I had to stain them to be black. If you want to watch that video and see how I turned all of the individual pieces, you can click here. After I'm done turning, I'll sand it with 220 grit sandpaper and then 320 grit. And then I'll just clean up the base a little bit. Now for the finish, what I'm doing is I'm applying CA glue, and it's a fairly easy process. It requires multiple coats, but it's very easy. You just turn on the lathe and rub on a little bit, let it dry, and then sand it, reapply some more, sand it again, reapply some more, and I do that about 5 times. And that gives it a nice acrylic type of a finish. The CA glue that I'm using is from Starbond, and it's a medium thickness that I'm applying. And I'm putting on just a very light coat each time. Next, I'm making one of the rooks, and I'll just fly through this at high speed just so you can see the overall process. Next, I'm making one of the knights out of boxwood. Now, ebony is really nice to turn because it's a closed-grained wood, so it was much easier to turn than the hickory, actually. But compared to ebony, boxwood is really, really nice. It's softer and close-grained and just really nice to turn. Here I'm marking out the positions of the bottom as well as the thinnest point, which is about 3/4 of the way up toward the top. The glue was a little bit hard to squeeze out this time because some of the glue had hardened in the top. But the nice thing about the Starbond products is that they come packaged with some additional tips and additional tops, so that makes it easy to manage. And now using my disc sander, I'm just beveling the top. And then after I'm done that, then I just rub on a little bit of CA glue. I'm going to put a weight into the bottom of each piece. And in order to do that, I'm drilling a hole into the bottom of each piece. I'm starting with an 1/8 inch drill bit. And then I will use a 3/8 inch drill bit to make the hole larger, big enough for the lead sinker that I'm going to put in. It wasn't that easy to hold the pieces without them spinning and tearing off a little bit of skin each time. So I'm well aware of the danger of wearing gloves around rotating machinery, but I thought it was safer for me to wear gloves to prevent the tear out of skin on my hand. If you're new to this and you don't have a lot of experience around a drill press, I do not recommend that you do this. And you can see how the glove was worn away, so my hand would have been even worse. And now I'm drilling some 1/2 inch holes into a sheet of plywood, and I'm going to use this as a holder to hold the pieces while I insert the lead weight and apply some epoxy to the bottom. And I'm just using sinkers that a fisherman would use on a fishing line. And each of them fits nicely into the 3/8 inch hole. And then I'll just apply a little bit of epoxy to the bottom. The last time I made chess pieces, I made wooden plugs to fill the bottom. But in this case, I figured that epoxy was good enough, especially because I'm going to cover the bottom with black felt. And I'm just applying glue to the bottom of each piece and attaching it to the felt. And after letting it dry for a couple of hours, I can trim the felt off from around the bottom. So this part is the scariest for me. What I'm attempting to do is cut a slot into the head of the knight, and then I'll insert a little piece of wood to serve as the head. And this part is scary for me, not because my hand is close to the blade, but because there's a really good chance that the piece will break, or the top of the piece will have significant tear out, and then I would have to return another piece. And after all this work that's gone into it, I don't want that to happen. So I'm proceeding very carefully. And in this case, it was a success. I've already cut some little pieces of wood to serve as the heads, and I'm just using a little bit of CA glue to hold them in place. And the last thing I'm doing is buffing all of the pieces. This is really not a necessary step, but it definitely gives the pieces a nice, smooth, and glossy finish. And I had actually buffed the knight pieces before attaching their heads, otherwise it would be very difficult to do this. So I gotta ask, would you make it?